for the Department of Education. Would the clerk please take the roll?
Chairman Rogers.
Here.
Representative Glory.
Here.
Coffin.
Present.
Walsh. Singh.
Present.
Zemke.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
Would like to have a motion from the Department of Ed for excused absence for all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, that motion carries. We would have roll for committee for school aid, please.
Chairman Rogers.
Here.
Coffin. Glory. Walsh. Dillon.
Here.
Brown.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
And again, for excused absence for Representative Walsh. Support. All in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, motion carries.
Thank you. Chair Powell.
Madam Chairman, the Subcommittee on Education call to order. Take the roll.
Senator Pavlo.
Here.
Senator Emmons.
Here.
Senator Colbeck.
Here.
Senator Pappageorge.
Here.
Senator Gill.
Here.
Chair, there are 5 members present here with me.
Thank you.
That was fast.
Excellent, thank you. I'd also like to welcome glutton for punishment, Representative Tim Kelly, who chaired on the Common Core this past summer. Welcome to the hearing. And Senator Walker also. Could you call your roll?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Senate Appropriations Subcommittee for K-12 and Department of Ed will be called to order, and can the clerk call the roll, please?
Senator Walker.
Present.
Senator Pavlo. Senator Pappageorge.
Here.
Senator Cox.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 4 members present in the quorum.
No absence. Thank you. We're all set. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And again, thanks to all for joining us today. I'd like to get started with our presentation. As you all know, part of the discussion upon adoption of the resolution in the legislature to allow for funding of the Common Core state standards required that the Department of Education convene a study on all assessment options available to Michigan students and report that study by December 1st. This is our chance for the department to present to the legislative body on their findings of that study. So I appreciate the department coming in, and we will get right to it. I'd like to call up folks from the Michigan Department of Education, Mr. Joseph Martineau, Wendy Larvick. As a reminder, this is a presentation on the study's findings. We do plan to convene a hearing at a later date for more public comment on those. I'd like to, as we do questions from members, I'd like to make sure that we're keeping our questions to the assessment options in the study as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Chairwoman Lyons and Chairman Pavlo, Walker, and Rogers for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Wendy Larvick, and I serve as the Legislative Liaison for the Michigan Department of Education. With me today, I have Deputy Superintendent of Accountability Services, Joseph Martineau, and Vince Dean, who is MDE's Director of the Office of Standards and Assessment. Each gentleman will take an opportunity to speak on the report referenced by Chairwoman Lyons. As she mentioned, the report was provided to the legislature on December 1st, 2013, as a result of House Concurrent Resolution 11. You should have a copy of that report in front of you now. After several years of planning, the report indicates MDE's intent to move forward with existing contracts to provide a new computer adaptive assessment beginning in spring of 2015 that measures whether our students are on track to be career and college ready. MDE will roll out this assessment using the content provided by a state membership organization and the help of additional vendors for printing, shipping, scoring, reporting, and online administration. These competitively bid contracts are in place to administer the test through the 2014-2015 and 2015-2016 school years. It is important to note that the current plan to move forward does not involve Michigan being handed a test. Rather, we're accessing content that provides for greater flexibility. This content comes from the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, of which Michigan is a governing state with several leadership positions, as well as the second largest state participating in the consortium. We've had significant influence on the direction of the consortium and therefore can sincerely claim an element of state control with this test that we would not be able to claim with an existing test product from a testing vendor. Also worth mentioning is the savings based on the economies of scale that come from working together with other states in the consortium. Michigan schools have been preparing for this new assessment for 3 years, with piloting being done in a number of currently tested grades and student populations. While the test is computer adaptive, a paper and pencil option is available to all. This test also provides accommodations for students with special needs and English language learners. MDE firmly stands behind its decision to move forward with the planned assessment, and we encourage an additional RFP to be completed in late 2014 that would incorporate information from this report to put new contracts in place beginning in the 2016-2017 school year. And now I'll ask Vince Dean to begin his presentation on the report. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to share some of the information we learned as part of the development of this report. I'm going to begin by a summary of the materials that we produced and made available to the public and all the committees here. In addition to the actual report and the survey that we used to gather information from different service providers that were developing assessments aligned with the Common Core state standards, we included the full responses provided by each service provider, as well as our crosswalk, so that anybody who was interested could see which questions we used to develop the different categories around which we assigned a rating. Due to the timeline Wendy mentioned, it was we recognize that other people may have wanted to parse out that data in different ways or think about different survey questions in light of different categories, so we wanted to make sure that everybody had the same opportunity and resources that we used to develop the report to draw their own conclusions. A couple of notes around the survey responses we received. We did want to acknowledge and mention our appreciation for all service providers that did complete our survey for this report. It was a very challenging exercise in light of the timeline that they had as well, so we're very appreciative of all the companies that took an opportunity to do that and give us information. And also the only service provider that did provide a response that wasn't included or represented in the tables here is the NWEA group, Northwest Evaluation Associates, who has provided us a letter indicating why they were not able to complete the survey response, and that letter was included with all other service provider responses, so everyone has access to that as well.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. With your permission, Madam Chair, I neglected to also mention that our state superintendent is present today, Mike Flanagan. I apologize for that. He does have a meeting, so he won't be able to stay, but he is here to.
Well, hello and goodbye.
I'm going to be here for a while.
In terms of the organization of the report that we produced, we thought it was just absolutely important to capture what Michigan needs in terms of a high-stakes system. And we wanted to ensure that all the questions we had in the survey, and therefore the categories describing the different elements, encompassed all those characteristics that we know through our experience, through our interaction with the U.S. Education Department as approving assessments for use in high-stakes purposes statewide, that need to be represented in these different categories moving forward in our system. A key aspect also that can be seen in this, the organization of the report, is that we've always been advocating that the next generation assessments in Michigan need to be far more than a once-a-year snapshot test on student achievement. We need multiple components and elements to give us richer information on the progress of students. And so along those lines, the report has been laid out to include, and we asked specific survey questions about those types of summative tests, those high-stakes, secure tests that would be available that are appropriate for use in accountability systems, but also interim assessments. Those are types of tests that are available throughout the school year, are more flexible in their administration, provide information on student growth and achievement throughout the school year so people can adjust instruction along the way. And finally, formative assessment processes and resources. We specifically called out that category because it's an area that's often misunderstood. We included in the formative assessment section of the report a definition that calls out how formative assessment is a process used by teachers and students during instruction that allows for real-time information and feedback on how students are interacting with content and abilities to provide teachers with some resources and professional development tools so that right then and there they can modify instruction to help students make progress there. And so that's an important definition, and our survey questions around formative assessment were aligned with that because it's crystal clear that the research on formative assessment as a tool to improve student achievement must be consistent with that definition in its implementation. In terms of the development process of the rating system that we use to evaluate the survey responses that we received from the different service providers, 3 caveats here. We did not try to get into evaluating the quality of evidence against each service provider or comparing evidence across them. We directed staff to only look for the responses that clearly indicated the service provider understood what we were asking for and also included either evidence or a significant and robust plan to develop evidence to meet the needs that we were asking about. And nearly all the options described in the survey responses, all these different products we learned about, are under development. So a lot of the evidence doesn't yet exist in terms of technical quality, how the items perform, some of those things that will be available after these things are fully developed and administered operationally. So along those lines, because of those caveats or in light of them, we developed 3 broad categories, and we tried to develop kind of a consumer reports type look and feel to give folks a sense of these products in light of these categories appear to be on track to fully meet our requirements for the state. It's unclear if they are going to or not. They either may have misunderstood what we were asking for, or their plan to gather evidence doesn't match what we believe is going to be sufficient. Or the final category there is it doesn't appear that they understand what we were asking about, or they don't appear to have a plan to meet the evidence. And a few service providers on some categories did not provide a response to those survey questions, so we reflected that as well. So what we ended up with in terms of look and feel is this type of a snapshot report across these different categories. We have a description of why each category was important, this table display reflecting the survey questions that we compiled into these different categories. And again, we included a crosswalk in the appendix for people to look at exactly which questions we used for that purpose, and then a brief summary of which service providers appeared to meet or not meet those different aspects. Our conclusions, as Wendy described there, as we looked across the survey responses and all these different categories represented in the report, both thinking about the summative solutions, the interim assessment products, and the formative assessment resources and tools that these different companies and consortia are expecting to make available. Clearly, for us, Smarter Balance stood out as having the most evidence on the existing aspects that they've developed and the clearest plans for developing the type of evidence that we need to see to be able to confidently stand behind the assessment. And we know a great deal about those plans due to the role that Wendy mentioned, that we've been able to participate heavily in some of these development pieces here. So because we firmly believe that the best system being developed for Michigan students and educators is the Smarter Balanced consortium products, we plan to continue involvement in the development activities, as Wendy mentioned, administer these tests statewide in spring 15, continue with executing the competitively bid contracts we have in place for that purpose, but also use this report and the information in it as the foundation for a new request for proposals that we would put together and go out in order, on a timeline conducive to having new assessments in place, or to all these entities able to bid on assessments to be put into place for the 16-17 school year. So now I'm going to turn over the next portion of the presentation to Joseph, who's going to speak about some of the other considerations we had in terms of developing the report and then walk through each section briefly.
All right, thank you. We had essentially 4 overriding principles that we wanted to look at in developing the report. One is we wanted to make sure that this was adequately aligned to the Common Core, that we're actually measuring the adopted standards. 2, kind of a subset of that is because the Common Core talks so much more about high-level thinking, critical thinking skills, we couldn't do it with just the kind of traditional assessment that we've been used to. We needed to expand outside that and have more types of items where students are constructing a correct response rather than recognizing a correct response. That's a real significant shift in the way we do things. The third principle really was about local implications. Given that this really does have significant local implications, we wanted to make sure that given any reasonable alternative that meets those previous 2 criteria, that whatever's adopted needs to not have significant adverse local implications above any other reasonably available product. And the third is cost effectiveness, given meeting those 3 previous criteria. So those are the 3 large criteria that we had in writing this, and that guided the selection of all of our categories. So I do want to walk through just briefly the report that you have in front of you about why we chose the categories that we chose. So if you can go to page 6. Page 6 and 7, we did talk about content and item type alignment. This means that we have enough constructed response, we have enough extended tasks for students to do, and it adequately measures the Common Core. That's principles 1 and 2. If you go to the next page, transparency and governance, this really is about principle 3, which is local implications. The reason that, in particular, that first set of columns about clear opportunities for Michigan educators to participate in developing, reviewing, making sure that we don't have sensitive topics on there, things that would be biased and that kind of thing, is that we have learned over many years that having significant Michigan educator involvement is critical to getting reasonable buy-in to the results of the assessment. In addition, given that these things are being talked about for use in much higher stakes than they have in the past, including educator evaluations, it's critical for educators really to have a role in that. One of the things that we've also seen is that testing companies tend to do that. They tend to invite their educators from their large clients to come in and participate in these kind of activities. It's not a major ask. It's just something that is typically done in the industry anyway. Second, clear MDE opportunities for involvement in governance kinds of roles. One of the things that we need to make sure is, given the high-stakes nature of the uses of these assessments, we have to be able to say there are no black boxes. We have to be able to say we know all the processes, we know that they were all followed appropriately, and we know that we were able to validate all of the data that we received and validate that the processes were followed. That means that's particularly important if we were if a school district or the state were to be hauled into court over the use of these assessments in high-stakes manner. We would need to be able to say, yes, we know everything that's going on with this. We approved of the procedures, and we know that they were followed adequately. We need to be able to stand behind it and say it is a valid assessment and it is reliable for the uses to which it is being put. If you go to page 10 and 11, this also is about principle 3, local implications. That first column is that the solution will be available in a computer adaptive modality. Why is this about local implications? The answer to that is, if you have a computer adaptive assessment, every student receives a unique form. It's adapted to that specific student. There are 2 ways to really minimize issues when it comes to test security. One is to either have a computer adaptive assessment where everyone gets their unique form, or you have lots of forms of the assessment that can be given essentially randomly to students. If you don't do that, test security becomes a significant issue, and you have to do something like we currently do with paper and pencil testing, which is there's a set day on which students take a test. That becomes a significant local implication when you move online. When it's paper and pencil, not that big a deal. Everyone can sit down and take the test. When you move online, that means approximately a 1-to-1 computing ratio. 1-to-1 device-to-student ratio, and that is a significant local implication. The second one really is about logistics. We do need to have something in terms of at least computer-based. We need to have something at least computer-based, if not computer adaptive, because there's a lot of handling that goes on with paper and pencil. Reports get returned much later because we have all the paper processing, that kind of thing. We really do need to move online. That third one, including a paper and pencil option, is a significant local issue as well. There are significant numbers of schools that are not ready to move fully online. We need to make the opportunity available for continued paper and pencil administration, and then a retest option. Without a retest option, there may be something go wrong in a school. You need that opportunity to retest so that you don't lose that student in accountability and that kind of thing. If you go to the next one, test security, again, page 12 and 13, that first column, principle 3 again, local implications. The length of the testing window and the device ratio really depends on, do you have multiple forms, either through an adaptive assessment where there's an infinite number of forms, or lots and lots of forms that are fixed forms that you can select from a number of forms. If that's not available, then you have to shrink again that test window, or you have to have one-to-one computing. Significant local implications. And the question on test security, can we get the data we need adequately and soon enough to detect an issue such as cheating, so that we can go back out and say, okay, we need to re-administer because these are high-stakes use. We need to know this is valid. If we can't get that data in time, we wouldn't be able to stand behind the use of those and re-administer an assessment. So that's what that's about. Page 14 and 15, this again is about principle 3, no black box. If we are going to stand up and say to local districts, yes, we stand behind this, we stand behind the high-stakes use, we need to know that there's nothing that we can't find out about that particular process that we would be able to stand up and say, yes, valid. And then, of course, data availability on the reporting is really important. If you go to 16 and 17, this is about cost. I'm not going to talk a lot about this one because, as Vince talked about, there are some caveats with this report. To get real costs from every vendor, you would have to actually issue an RFP. And we did issue an RFP previously, but many of these vendors didn't respond. So we only have costs for a small number of vendors that are actual costs. So I'd like to skip to, at this point, page 32 and 33. This really is, again, about principle 2. How many constructed response items, how many of these items where a student has to produce a correct answer rather than recognize a correct answer are available on both the summative assessment and on the interim assessment? How well can we actually measure their critical thinking skills and high-level thinking skills? And that really depends on how many constructed response are available in the package. There are just a couple more, and then I'll stop. If you go to 34 and 35, this is about principle 3 as well. Local implications. We have a large variety of what are called accommodations on our assessment that make it, that make people available, that make the content of the assessment accessible to English language learners and students with disabilities who have a particular, some disability that might block them from adequately accessing without that accommodation. We have a large number of those. It's really important not to reduce that when we go to a new assessment system. If you look at the next page, which is technical requirements, this again is about local control and principle 3, local implications. We are a local control state. We do not tell districts what devices they're going to buy for their students. And we need to have as many of those devices that are out there that school districts have elected to buy available for use with the online assessment. And if you look at the chart on the bottom, there's really a large variance in the bandwidth required to be able to administer various ones of these different assessments. And what we found out through our data is that Michigan, data that schools have submitted about technical readiness for the assessment, is that Michigan is extraordinarily sensitive to bandwidth requirements. So that wide variance is going to have an impact on how many schools are ready to administer the assessment. Going to page 38 and 39, as Vince said, formative, you've got the 3 category system that we're talking about, that once a year summative assessments, appropriate for accountability use, multiple times through the year, interim assessments measuring growth over time, more diagnostic, and then this formative assessment. The formative assessment really is about what people do in the classroom and getting professional development, which will be so critical in moving to a much more rigorous set of standards. This is about getting people the help they need in their classrooms to respond to this change. And that's one reason that whether or not they had a compatible definition was so important to us. Because as Vince said, the research says if you do it the way the literature talks about formative assessment, you will see significant gains in student achievement. If you don't, the literature does not say that. So it's really important for us to be able to provide that as a part of this overall system. And lastly, the local implications. I did talk a lot about this in terms of already, how long can the test window be? How many devices do you have to have, one-to-one device ratios, device-to-student ratios, what kinds of device you can select, and then how much impact that bandwidth requirement has on the readiness of schools to be able to go online. So I'll hand it back to Vince at this point.
Thank you. We just wanted to call your attention to a little bit more detail on a couple of, just two sections. One around the content and item type alignment piece here. And Joseph spoke about how, with higher order content, more rigorous content, this will be the first time with this assessment system we're looking at assessing things like listening and speaking for all students, not just our English learners. But we wanted to look at this also in light of the aspect that nobody earned a perfect score across the board in this category. So this is one example of where there's tremendous value in this report for informing the development of the next RFP. So we have very clear indications of who's on track to meeting state requirements, who's got a long way to go, and what types of responses and information and things to guide pricing and things like that we need as we move forward with our next generation assessment system. And finally here, this piece here, we wanted to call out here because it's the only category or column that was based on one single survey question. This was an issue that was a major theme in all the legislative hearings around the Common Core state standards. It's an essential element for any system around assessment that's going to be used for these high stakes and accountability purposes. But this idea of clear evidence that Michigan will retain sole and exclusive ownership of personally identifiable student data. And this one there was no half circles. This was pretty much a yes or no, and was clear to us where we would have opportunities to really retain that type of control that we've had. Joseph.
So some additional concerns that we've heard over time. In particular, why is it important for Michigan involvement? Again, it is. There's really no room for black box. We don't really get to peek inside all of those processes and really understand what's happening. And really Michigan teacher buy-in, as I talked about in terms of, yes, we have people Michigan teachers actually writing the items, reviewing them for appropriateness, and making sure that they're accessible to students with disabilities and English language learners. So that's an important piece. Multiple measures. That's really something that is really critical in doing things like educator evaluation. You don't want to base it all on just one. You need multiple measures, and this provides us an opportunity to have multiple measures in addition to what might be put in place with local measures. We're also talking about testing time. We do acknowledge that there would be a modest increase over what existing testing time is because more constructed response, there's more opportunity, there's more need for students to have time to sit down and write out those constructed response. That's just a part of increasing the depth of knowledge that we're asking students to demonstrate. Data and reports, we really do have a need to have a dynamic reporting system available that teachers would be able to just move into and get a testing history, be able to look at how students have done over time, be able to get as much data as they can about individual students on demand. Paper and pencil availability, again, is critical. Not all schools are ready for this. And technology readiness is a significant factor in moving forward on this. So I can go to the next one. The current path, why the current path is best for students. One, students are ready for online. They're online all the time. Paper and pencil really is outmoded. If we can move away from paper and pencil, we really want to go in that direction. Computer adaptive testing really does provide the best measurement, and it does allow for minimizing testing length over what is even a more robust set of content than we previously had. Fully aligned summative and interim tests with the same types of items. will provide multiple measures and rich information to teachers, and it is critical that that interim assessment that measures multiple times during the year to kind of give a how are they doing before you get to that end of year test, have the same kind of rich items on it as that end of year test, or that we won't really know are they ready. We do need to have the adequate constructed response items and comprehensive formative assessment. I have been encouraged in many meetings in which I've been presenting, don't forget just how important that formative assessment is, and that's true. That's what will really drive the change in the classroom, because it's professional development. This is really focused on teachers and what happens day to day with kids. And lastly, we do have a full set of accessibility features. We can't move backward on how much we provide in terms of accessibility to English language learners and students with disabilities.
Just in closing, we had a couple pieces of information we thought we'd share with you that's updated. We do have information through our Michigan Technology Readiness Assessment tool about how many schools are on track to be ready for meeting minimum or recommended specifications to administer these online assessments. And you can see over the last year from December of 2012 to just last month, a significant increase in the number of schools that are meeting those minimum specifications. So that is very consistent with the 4 years of online pilot testing that we've done to get ready for this. And we're looking forward to the vast majority of schools being ready to administer these assessments in spring of 15. And finally, just as a reminder, we have had a robust opportunity. It's very real and substantive about this leading role with Smarter Balance. So all aspects of assessment design, item development, the technology issues, reporting system, and the governance pieces Joseph spoke about. We've been fortunate to not have those black boxes and be very confident that we won't have any when the system becomes operational. So that's our material. I think we're ready to do some questions.
Thank you very much. Before we begin questions, I want to recognize a couple elected officials in the room. From the State Board of Education, Eileen Weiser is here today. Thank you for coming. Also, the Senate Majority Leader, Randy Richardville, was here. I think he may have stepped out. And I see Representative Martin Hauerlach back in the room. Thank you for attending as well. Also, Representative Paul Muxlow, are you here as well? Thank you. Okay, Senator Colbeck.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for the work you put into this report. I appreciate all the hard work there. I got a few questions. Wendy, in your opening statement, you talked about that you're very confident that we can talk about this as providing some degree of state control. Joseph, I think you followed up and talked about our proud lineage of local control here in the state. When I've reviewed some of the evaluation matrices in the report, it talks about participation. It doesn't talk about control. And when I'm thinking control, I think we have final decision authority. I was wondering if you could help and be very specific about what elements of the assessment will we at the state of Michigan have control, and what degree, what will we have control over at the local school district level? To what degree will, specifically, what will we have control of? What decisions will we have control over? And just to kind of prime the pump on the area of content in regards to the assessment, I was wondering, do we, by control, do we pick from a portfolio of questions or content that's already been provided by the consortium, or do we get an opportunity to go off and insert our own questions into the mix to supplant questions that may have been pushed forward by the consortium? And if we do that, who's responsible, who has the authority or governance authority to do that?
So let me start with the first question, which is how do we have control over what goes on with the consortium? One is the governance model of the consortium is consensus. We do have a process in which any vote that is taken by the consortium must meet consensus twice. It must meet consensus, I'm sorry, not twice, but it must meet consensus. If we don't get there with the first vote, the issue is tabled. And if we don't meet consensus on the second vote, the issue is tabled again until we have opportunity to discuss and make sure that everyone can be happy with the solution. Every state in the consortium can be happy with the solution. If we were to get to that point and still not have consensus, then it is a supermajority vote. We've never gotten past the second. The issue is that the consortium really, the issues that every state faces in terms of what is appropriate to do on the assessment, what are the appropriate things to do for development and so on, the consortium has been extraordinarily good, and there are extraordinary incentives to be able to come up with a solution that will be acceptable to every member state in the organization. So in particular, we also, as a governing member in the consortium, have the right to sit on work committees that make the decisions, that make recommendations and develop procedures that ultimately go to a vote. So not only do we vote on it, but we work on the development of any of those policies and procedures before they go to a vote, so that we're not going to be surprised. And if we are going to be concerned about a specific issue, it will come up in the development phase, not in the vote phase.
Just to follow up on that, when you say we, if I may, Madam Chair, who specifically? I mean, we're talking Department of Ed representatives.
Right, Department of Education is the entity that has the vote in the consortium.
Thank you. Senator Pavlo, Chair Pavlo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Joseph, I'll direct this comment to you, and I know that Vince addressed it in his comments as well, that you're going to be going out in 2014-15 looking for more RFPs. What will those include? What else are you looking for that hasn't been addressed in this report?
I think anything with that doesn't have a full circle anywhere, we would want a full circle across the board with whatever we were to go out for bid for something to follow on to this in the 16-17 school year. You want to?
Yes, I'd agree with that. We wouldn't want to take any step backward. That's as we flesh out these categories. So we have lots of experience with RFPs around summative assessments. So we have a lot of requirements there. We're learning more and looking forward to what we would need in terms of the interim assessment solution. So as Joseph mentioned, those will be part of the conversation around educator evaluations. And so as we see how that plays out, and that will help define our requirements around interim assessment pieces. And then we look forward to the types of tangible formative assessment and professional development resources that we're looking forward to having in the next assessment system that have been especially around the professional development piece, somewhat of a shortcoming to date here. And so as we get into a more complex system that's measuring more complex things, we need richer, stronger professional development in order to help that impact student achievement.
And then quickly as a follow-up, during the whole Common Core and the assessment piece of our conversation through the legislature, one of the most difficult things in that process was trying to figure out the cost of not only Common Core, but what an assessment model is. You presented a very comprehensive report that measures dozens of benchmarks, but on the financial estimate, you indicate in the report that it's unclear as to the actual cost. I understand that a further detailed process on an RFP could be included, but how far off could we potentially be, and how will we know what the system is going to cost? Because you've pegged a number at Developing Michigan's assessment at nearly $30 million. Can you weigh those two concepts so we can better understand that?
Yes. So I'm going to take your first point. If we were to develop our own assessment, we would lose significantly on the economies of scale that we've gained through working through the consortium. We would, to develop a fixed form assessment, would probably be around $30 million. To develop a computer adaptive assessment that is as robust as what the consortium is looking at, we would be talking probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $70 million, because you have so many items that you have to develop for a computer adaptive assessment. So we've gained an incredible amount in terms of economies of scale on the development side with the consortium. We do have we do have known costs for the paper and pencil side, the scoring side, and the printing side of the contracts that we currently have. We are still nailing down the final details. We're not quite there yet on the online administration portion, so we can't give exact costs yet on that. We're close. They are clearly within the ballpark that is presented in the report in terms of everything that you can see in that report. And I would say, given how little information there was for people to base their estimates on, this is it wasn't a detailed RFP that we sent out to all these contractors and say, bid on this, tell us how much it would cost. They had to make some pretty significant assumptions that we may or may not agree with. So, but I can say that we would be within the ballpark that is in this report.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chair Walker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One quick comment. It's not a secret, and the department has been outspoken about its interest in using the Smarter Balanced test for quite a few years. And then, I have a kind of a red flag goes up for me because you publish criteria for evaluating different tests, and Smarter Balanced meets all of those. And I'm not going to ask you to disprove, or I should say prove a negative that you didn't do, gear the criteria towards a Smarter Balance, which you were interested in all the time. But I'm just letting you know that I'm a little bit, I want to study it some more to make sure that it was a fair assessment of all the different tests that are out there. We have computer adaptive testing that's being used by Detroit and Grand Rapids and many charter schools, which in many respects is geared towards Common Core curriculum, and they don't even appear on the list of those that responded. So I've got a little bit of a red flag on how the criteria was developed and why everybody didn't respond. I just want to express one of my concerns in looking at your evaluation. And then, Madam Chair, I've got a member with a question too. Senator Pappageorge has a question.
Okay.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair. My concerns are much like Senator Walker's, and let me begin. What is Smarter Balance? Is it a set of folks? Is it a company? Is it a concept? And who do I send a check to?
So those are great questions. Smarter Balanced is not a vendor. It is not a company. It is a state membership organization. Smarter Balanced develops the content that would then be provided to states for that membership fee. That would then, we then issue requests for proposals to administer the content of that assessment. It is not an administration vendor. We actually have to go out and competitively bid for administration scoring, reporting, data files, that kind of thing. So it's a membership organization that provides content to states.
In a lot of ways, Smarter Balance sounds like a sole source contract to you guys.
So I would say Smarter Balanced is a membership organization which states voluntarily join so that they can get the economies of scale on developing the content that they would not otherwise be able to get.
Yeah, and it's the only membership organization that's recognized in this whole thing.
No, Partnership for Assessment of Readiness of College and Career is also recognized in this report.
And how does that play in this thing? You've already decided you had two choices and you picked one. I'm just trying to figure out what's going on here.
So I think the issue is we have participated in Smarter Balance because when the two consortium decided to band together, when the two consortia decided to band states together to work on this so that they could achieve the economies of scale, we looked at the plans that the two consortia had, and we said we would like to be a governing state in Smarter Balance, particularly because it was proposing a computer adaptive test, which is going to be a much more secure assessment. You're going to get the economies of time that computer adaptive assessment will give you. So we decided to become a governing state in that, knowing that if Smarter Balanced was not successful, we could always go back to Park, or we could go out to something else. So we have participated to make sure that there is something that will be viable for the state to administer in time for the 14-15 school year. We developed these criteria based on those four principles that I talked about, but also based on three documents. The first document is the Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing. That is the ethical standards for our field. It's developed by the American Educational Research Association, the American Psychological Association, and the National Council on Measurement and Education. We developed the criteria based on that. We also developed it based on another workbook that has been put together by the Council of Chief State School Officers and the Association of Test Publishers to look at what are best practices in large-scale assessment. We used that as well in the criteria, and we used finally the U.S. Department of Education peer review guidance, essentially which says these are the things that you have to do in order for you to get peer review approval of your assessment system to meet the requirements of ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act.
Well, so you started out with two competitors, and the two competitors joined up with each other, and it's called Smarter Balance now, and it sure smacks of a sole source contract. I'm worried that after you put out all your RFPs, and you honestly and work hard at getting the best answer and so forth, then we're going to get a call saying, well, we figured it all out, send money. And I'm concerned it's sort of the sole sourceness of this whole thing. But it's early in the process, so that's all I'll say on that point.
Thank you.
Wait,
Representative.
I have a second question, please, madam.
Of course.
What's the purpose of this whole thing? Let me tell you what mine is, and you know what I'm going to say. The purpose is to measure individual student growth. And if we don't do individual student growth, the rest of it doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, with individual student growth comes, oh my goodness, one teacher is better than another one at that, and now the teachers are at risk to this system when it comes to teacher evaluation. Now, if the whole purpose of this thing is not to measure individual student growth, which hasn't been mentioned enough here today, I don't know what we're doing. And I don't even expect an answer to that one until the next meeting. And I thank you.
Actually, I expect an answer. Was student growth accounted for within this study, or was it assumed that the assessment would measure student growth? I think that's something that's paramount to all of us up here when it comes to what assessment we select for, or we fund for our students.
Yes, that was clearly taken into account in that the summative assessment is given once a year. You can measure growth from one year to the next. The interim assessment is given to measure growth within a year. The formative assessment is for teachers to gather data about where their students are and the progress that they're making. So all three components really are focused on growth.
Thank you for that clarification. I also want to point out that we have Representative Mike Calton, who has joined us. Thank you for attending as well. Representative Knezek.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and again, thank you to you three for your work on this issue. I just wanted to point out briefly, just because I think it sort of ties into a larger narrative, when it was brought up about the NWEA letter, the letter was not simply to state that they couldn't fill out the survey, they were too pressed for time. It was to say that the format of the survey was insufficient. And so for me, that gives me a great deal of pause in wondering, first and foremost, the quality of the survey that was put out by the MDE. The NWEA specifically states that it restricted the information that they had wanted to give to help us make the best decision possible. And that concern is compounded by the fact that even within your PowerPoint presentation, on slide 4, you admit that you did not have sufficient time to evaluate the quality of evidence. So if we're looking at evidence that we are not even confident in, how confident can we as a legislature be in the quality of this entire report? And I have another question too, Madam Chair.
Yes, we were very careful in the development of this, of the categories that we used, the questions that we put into the survey. We were also very confident that if they could respond adequately to the questions that are in the survey, we would be able to make a reasonable judgment. I think the issue is on being able to look at specifically and dig into deeply the quality. We had a December 1st timeline. We did have a December 1st timeline. What we did, however, is we looked at those data and we said, is there evidence that they will be able to make this? We did not pick apart every piece of that evidence, which we would have liked to have been able to do. But we looked at that evidence with enough scrutiny to be able to make the conclusion of those 3 boxes. We might have wanted to be able to do a 1 to 10 rating. Couldn't do it on the timeline. But we could adequately make the full box, mid box, and half box.
And I'm not trying to be overly critical, because I understand the fact that you guys were on this timeline. But if I'm understanding what you're saying, it's that in a perfect world, you would have done a much deeper dive. But what you were able to do was sort of bare bones, if you will.
I would say it's not as fine-grained as we would like, but we're confident in the report.
Okay. And then my last question, Madam Chair, please. Looking at slide 15 of the presentation today, I was really struck by the fact that apparently 86% of our schools are ready for online testing. I can't think of a single school in my school district that is 86 or 8% ready for online testing. And so I'm wondering what your criteria for readiness is, and also what your criteria for minimum specifications are.
The criteria in the technology readiness tool around those specifications they have to do with a variety of things. One is around bandwidth, going to the individual buildings, into districts, device to student ratio, types of devices in terms of how current they are, their operating systems and things like that. And so those aggregate numbers of 86% meeting minimum specifications is based on a variety of those factors.
So what's the ratio? I mean, if I've got 1 computer for every 50 kids, 1 computer for every 100 kids, because we've got schools with thousands of kids in them, 1 computer lab, we're going to expect to give them a computer-based assessment. How are we cycling these kids in? What is the ratio that meets that threshold for a minimum specification? Or is that something maybe I can follow up with you after the fact?
Absolutely, could follow up with that after the fact. I will say that as part of inputting data into this MTRAX system, schools are able to play out a variety of different scenarios. They have some almost slider bars about things like ratio. And one other thing to remember about these computer-administered assessments, whether they're adaptive or not, is they'll be administered over a test window. So right now we have very strict administration things where all kids take MEP math on Tuesday with some makeup days. These windows where we're looking at with all of these online options where we have 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, that provides a lot of opportunity for readiness with a lower student-to-device ratio.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Emmons.
Almost asleep. No, not really. Thank you. Appreciate you being here, and I do, with your indulgence, have 3, and I don't think they will require lengthy answers. Just, you referenced that the content is aligned with the Common Core, and I'm wondering if you mean that it's aligned with the standards, or if it is aligned with the resource kits that support the standards.
Answer to the first question is to the standards.
Okay, all right. Let me ask you this. Have you had any weigh-in from the universities?
Actually, yes, there has been heavy involvement of institutes of higher education, Michigan Institutes of Higher Education, so a little governance of the consortium. Each state has a K-12 lead and a higher education lead. Votes occur in terms of both. We have to get unanimity among both K-12 and higher education, which, as you may guess, is not easy. But that's the governance model. So the higher education folks have been involved from the beginning, and they have provided an incredible amount of feedback and made significant modifications to design to meet their needs as well.
One last question that I am curious, do you have any financial documents regarding the consortium and what has transpired with them? Is there a report somewhere on the finances of the consortium?
Yes, there is a report on the finances of the consortium, and I can provide you a link to that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative McMillan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your presentation. When we were working on the resolution, I remember the portion that talked about this report, and it said that in preparation for receipt of this report, State Board of Education may take steps to remove conflicts of interest. And getting to Senator Walker, Senator Pappageorge, Representative Knezek's concerns, aren't we bound by a contract that says we will do everything in our power to make sure that SBAC is successful? And knowing that that is there, I thought that this is going to be a very difficult thing for you to do objectively. So I'm wondering, how did you do this objectively to make sure that NWEA didn't get the time or the ability to, I mean, it seems to me by contract you had to not be fair. And you were given the opportunity to try to remove those conflicts. I'm curious how you attempted to do that. And I guess that's my first question.
I think the issue there is we do not have a contract with Smarter Balance.
Memorandum of Understanding.
We have a memorandum of understanding, which is actually non-binding. We are there to provide votes on something that would provide us with something good. But if there's, frankly, if there is something that can provide us something better, I am responsible for, here's the idea. I am responsible, and the Department of Education will be holding the bag if something goes wrong with the assessment. If something goes wrong with the assessment, I do not want to have chosen something that is not going to give me the very best thing that I can get. I do not have an interest in an inferior product because I have to defend it.
So you're not bound. So you just said that the memorandum of understanding, you could violate that, and there's no problem whatsoever in violating it.
We would simply lose our governing state status, which we would be willing to do if we needed to.
Okay, but you didn't do that, so you met the requirement to make sure that the success of SBAC is paramount when you were developing this report, because we're still a governing member.
We do not have a binding agreement to ensure the success of the consortium.
I'd like to add to that. I think this is the reason you guys didn't want me to come, because you know how I can get. But I'm a little disturbed by the tone. I mean, first of all, there's nothing to be gained by any individual sitting here by any of these decisions personally. And secondly, I would ask respectfully that we be given timelines that are appropriate. This is 6 weeks after the timeline of our report, which was Thanksgiving weekend, that our folks worked literally around the clock for weeks in order to meet this timeline, including through that weekend. I think we literally got it in like at 12:59 on that Saturday or Sunday night or whatever it was. So respectfully, I would ask that particularly to the tone that maybe we should be in more depth or more granular, that some of that would be with a thoughtful and appreciated timeline. And then, you know, I think where I think we haven't done a good job yet is to understand ultimately how there's bidding involved in this. I know you've said it, but maybe it deserves repeating. I mean, can you help with that, Joseph? Because I think it will get at the representative's issue.
Yes. Again, it gets to the content is provided by the consortium. We bid out the administration scoring and reporting, but that's not the only place that bidding is required. Bidding has also been required by the consortium because the consortium states believe that is the most appropriate way to do business. Everything that has been done by the consortium has been done through the competitive bidding process. It's part and parcel throughout the entire consortium and throughout all the work that we do.
Okay, and I'll try to be, I don't think you answered Senator Colbeck's question about tests or the questions and the body of questions. Isn't there going to be a goal of comparability? So we really don't have the ability to change questions because there's going to be comparability. And if we're talking, as we step back, and that's one of the main goals of this, or it's one of the important parts of it, how do you compare these states, we got many states are bailing on these tests. Park, a lot of states are getting out of Park. I would suspect many will be getting out of Smarter Balance as well because they want control. They don't want the feds overseeing. Feds have a committee because they gave $200 million to Smarter Balance, so they want to get something in return. So they've got test validation committees that are watching the questions. So, how do you compare, Park is a paper pencil or it's not computer adaptive. How are you going to compare those states to states that have computer adaptive SBAC to the many states that are going to be doing paper and pencil SBAC? You can't swap out the next question on a paper pencil test, so you can't, so that's a completely different test. I mean, are we really, if we would step back and say the objectives and how this was sold, none of it's going to happen. So maybe we should do our own test, and you said that it would cost $70 million. If we got together with some of those other states and said, let's all get together and develop something that is flexible, that states can swap out what their standards are. If we have problems with geometry and we heard that it's really bad in Common Core, we want to do the good geometry. You can have those test questions. There could be some savings of, if we did our own test with maybe a few groups of a few other states. So I guess I just want to look at the objective and say this really isn't going to happen how it was sold to us. So let's step back and really look at what our alternatives really are.
Well, I did want to correct some misunderstandings in those statements. First, the feds do not have a committee watching over what we're doing.
They don't have a question validation committee?
No. They do not have a question validation committee. We have teachers from all of the states in the consortium reviewing the questions for appropriateness. Nothing to do with the feds. Second, we don't actually have a requirement. There are requirements of the grant. We are carrying out the requirements of the grant. Everything else, which is to develop an assessment that measures the Common Core. That's essentially the requirements of the grant. That then is really about how we decide as state members what we want to happen with it. And as I said, that has been done in a unanimous nature with every single vote that has been taken by the consortium. Never a dissenting vote on that final vote.
The Common Core is going to change. The standards are going to change. So as those change, states may not like some of these questions. You haven't had any controversy yet because nobody's been implementing it yet, other than New York, and you saw what happened there.
So,
well, their part.
So there is no requirement for comparability across the two consortium. We just need something that's comparable within the consortium. And frankly, given the sensitivity of the entire consortium, all the states in the entire consortium, if there is a standard in the Common Core that is a problem for a state, the states would get together and say, this really is an issue in the state. We don't want that kind of controversy, just don't want it. We would, as a consortium, be able to say, nope, not going to do that one. We, as a state, get the content. We get the content, we get the bank of questions. If we were to identify a question that was problematic, we would have the right to remove that from our bank and not administer it. It's just the misinformation about the level of control that states have over this is really problematic.
Comparable then, if we can swap out questions. There's not going to be any comparability, so let's get that off the table.
And the issue is, again, if you have 99% of the questions in common, we have yet to have anyone say what particular standard is problematic. I doubt that we would have anything like that happen with individual questions, but if it were to happen.
Or 95%.
So, the issue is, when you have that level of comparability, when you have that level of commonality, you can still retain comparability from a psychometric viewpoint.
Thank you. Representative Janetsky.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In looking at pages 6 and 7 of the booklet and how people got their full ovals or their circles all the way filled in, the part that concerns me the most, again, and it's been alluded to, is the content aligned with the Common Core standards. And I bring it bring my concern as a background of former teacher, knowing that at some point teachers are going to be evaluated statewide and possibly have their pay determined on how they teach to the Common Core and on how their students test. And so when we look at that content aligned to Common Core standards, can you take us through the process by which the content was determined to be aligned to the Common Core?
Yes, thank you for that question. What we looked at there in terms of the content alignment piece, both for the first two columns there primarily, what had to do with around did the solutions being proposed by the different service providers address the 5 subject areas that the Common Core represents. They're reading, mathematics, writing, listening, and speaking. And that also that they provided evidence or an affirmation that, yes, our intention is that our summative or interim products will be aligned with the Common Core state standards. And here is our plan to conduct alignment studies or some other, gather some other evidence that once, as these assessments, the items are written, the assessments become operational, that they're going to be pursuing that specific purpose.
So all that was shared with you really is process. They didn't show you this is the standard and these are the questions we'll produce based on that standard?
A lot of them had very concrete plans. A lot of them have developed the vast majority of items that will be used, so they have done some of those.
And the department was
studies.
able to see the items and measure them against the...
We were provided that information for some of the service providers, but not all. And others may have had plans or as indicated here, they did not indicate that they were going to go in that direction.
Was Smarter Balance able to provide test questions aligned and show you exactly this question answers this standard or gives the knowledge that would be tested under this standard?
They were able to provide several hundred test questions that represented the full blueprint of the assessment, and then also the item specifications that all item writers and reviewers are expected to follow for items of every type at every grade level. And then also their evidence around the plans they had following the operational administration to conduct alignment studies, as was the case with most.
Is any of that information available to the committee?
Absolutely.
I'd be interested in seeing the content they provided based on the standards. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Representative Abed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for the presentation. I share Chair Walker's concern on objectivity. And as we talk about smarter balance, it just does not appear that we are balanced in the approach looking at this assessment. And with all due respect, it just is not a surprise that smarter balance is the best alternative. And I just have many concerns, some that haven't been expressed yet. There's 4, but I'm only going to talk about one, but the 4 basically are fiscally responsibility, flexibility, technology readiness, and the fact that it is a longer test. But I'm just going to go with my very first one, which is being fiscally responsible. Somehow I don't think it's a very responsible thing to say, let's keep investing money and put more money into smarter balance when really, you know what, that may not be the best, but it's the best we've got now. And so let's put the money in, but then we can get some more RFPs down the road, and then we can change. But we know that once you're in a system, it's so hard to get out. And we've seen that with No Child Left Behind. It's something that once you're in, it is like getting out of a deep hole. So I just have a lot of concern about wasting money or putting more money doing professional development, investing in the tests at a time when maybe we're not ready for that test. Maybe we don't know enough, or maybe we want to look objectively at other alternatives. People have not had the opportunity to develop tests that might go along with Common Core as Smarter Balanced has, since they already knew that they thought they were going to get this contract. So I just have a lot of concerns about being fiscally responsible at a time when our schools are so tight and our communities are so tight, and we are so tight at the state, that at a time when all that we have to think about, that to go into a test and invest more money and more time and then say later we can get out worries me.
You know, I think the concerns are legitimate on the costs, and that's your role, and we appreciate your pushing us on those issues, because that's what we should do, is we should make smart decisions about the money spent. There is an urgency because this body passed laws required to teacher evaluation, in my view, prematurely before we were ready to have growth instruments in place. So we're scrambling, and local districts have done the best they can But I'm worried about the fact that some teachers have been rated in ways because of the requirement of the law without really being assured that we have tests yet that are actually up to doing that based on your questions earlier on growth. So I don't at all. I approve of and think it was the right thing to do to get towards teacher evaluation that includes student achievement growth. I think the timeline, if I had my way, would have been tiered in over time so that it aligned with the time that we actually had tests that we could rely on. But right now, what they're dealing with is, in a way, the worst of both worlds.
Madam Chair, could I follow up on that? Thank you for bringing that up. It sounds like that you might be in agreement with Dr. Ball's statement about when you have a new program like Common Core, you should wait 2 years to do an assessment tool. And that goes along with, I know Governor Brown in California is very concerned about having a test when Common Core is just being adopted. So would you kind of concur that it would be advantageous to wait before implementation of a method like this while we're still trying a new program? We haven't even implemented a new program.
Having sat on the council with Dean Ball, one of the things that was recommended was that it not go fully into place until the year after the first implementation of this new assessment system, so that it would meet exactly that requirement, which is also one of the reasons why you would want to get something based on Common Core in place as soon as possible. A second reason to do that is that these were adopted in 2010. Schools have been working on them for quite some time. We need to start measuring it.
Thank you. Senator Caswell.
Well, thank you for all your hard work on this. You've obviously spent a lot of time in put in a lot of effort in a very short amount of time, and I sincerely appreciate it. 6 weeks is not nearly enough time to do this whole thing justice and present us with clear and convincing evidence and so on and so forth. You mentioned local control, and I might add, Director Flanagan, that I didn't vote for that teacher evaluation bill. So, you mentioned local control, and I kind of like when local folks get to decide for themselves. And I know you weren't charged with this as a department, so I understand if you didn't look at it, but I guess I keep struggling with the fact, why do we have to have an assessment? You've located, or you've indicated, goodness gracious, 10 or 12 different assessments here that are all based on these standards that were established. And, well, I have here from a school district that says they're pretty fired up about the ACT Aspire, which is, I see is on your list. And they want to do that, and they said, I have several reasons for this, but one of the major influences is that the ACT Aspire leads to the ACT test. This actually means something to students, which caused a flashback for this old man that in the early 80s when we put the MEP in place and kids would walk in and sign their name and walk out and there'd be nothing on the test. And we ended up starting to bribe them later on with a scholarship in order to get them to actually take the test seriously. They then went on and talked about this particular school has created a testing structure where 8th grade students take the Explore test and 9th and 10th grade take the Plan. And with this information, we've been able to increase our test scores and assist students on an individual level, and they go on. Which, as I listen to the testimony here, I hear the fact that we kind of got things a little backwards, and schools have, because of the evaluation piece, have been forced to go out and do something so that they can evaluate their teachers. I guess, why do we have to pick an assessment? Local control means variety is the spice of life. This school's obviously got it figured out for themselves using that particular test. That doesn't lock us into one thing. I've heard a lot of concerns from various legislators here that, you know, we get locked into something, we're stuck there forever, which I can attest to that as a former superintendent with a company that was very cheap to start with and got very expensive about 2 years later when the first contract ran out. Why aren't we just let them do their own thing with the tests that are available. And, maybe if some are more expensive than others and we say, well, we'll pay this. If you want to do something else, that's fine. You take it out of your budget if that's what you've set up. But if they've already set up and they've already got things going in the direction that they're comfortable with, why in the name of heaven are we going to yank their chain and send them off in another direction? Let them do their thing as long as it's a test and it's meeting the criteria and they can do everything they're supposed to do. Am I missing something here? I know I'm a little slow sometimes, but.
We do have federal law that requires a single test for accountability purposes.
You mean to tell me the federal government wants to dictate everything? That's just shocking. Go ahead.
Yes, we do have that is required. We also have state law that requires that we select an assessment, which I know that can be changed. The issue also has to do with really comparability and fairness from one district to the next. Are we seeing something that is really different from one to the next? Those statewide assessments are the only ways that they are the only metric that we have that lets us know, are we getting something for a reasonable return on the investment that we're putting in? It's the only metric that we have that can be compared across states. In particular, as you may know as a former educator, things can be very different. An A can mean something very different from one school system to the next. And a passing grade can mean something very different from one school system to the next. And this is our only way to actually have that kind of comparability from one district, from one school, from one teacher to the next.
And I'll just add one that I'm struggling with and losing some sleep over and punted in December because I don't think I'm ready to make the call yet, but that is that legislation requires me to ultimately, the department, to ultimately take schools that aren't showing satisfactory progress, who've been within the school reform office for 3 years, and out of 4,000 schools is just a handful, maybe 10, but to put them into the state reform district. And then thereby the controversy related to the EAA and all that stuff. And from my point of view, we should have options beyond the EAA, if I can slip that in while I'm with so many of you, that it shouldn't be just the EAA, it should be other options that we could, remember, they don't go to the EAA.
Let's keep the discussion on assessments, thank you.
Okay. So I'll get back to that. But on a serious note, the reason for the assessments is how else are we going to determine? It's got to be one of the measures that we have to determine whether a school is making satisfactory progress, which is required within the law. So that's...
Well, Joe, help me to understand here. All these entities that you've looked at, these 10 or 12 entities, all have a test that are assessing the Common Core standards, right?
To different degrees.
Oh, okay, well, fine.
Right.
But they're all assessing the Common Core standards. Now, you like some better than others, and that's fine. But if they're all assessing the same standard, then it's obviously going to show whether Buckshot Bill and Buckshot Billy are learning anything. It's going to show improvement in that student. Why do I, now I'm serious here, why do I as a parent care whether Mark Caswell compares favorably or not with Susie Smith in Iowa? Why do I care? All I care is that Mark Caswell's learning the material he's supposed to learn. What's this fascination we have with comparing to the world?
So to clarify, we're talking about comparability within state. It's important for us to be able to make those decisions, those high-stakes decisions that Superintendent Flanagan talked about, based on comparable data from one school district to the next, one school to the next. That does not preclude any school district from doing whatever else they want to do. It certainly does not preclude that. However, the need for comparable information from one district to the next and one school to the next is pretty paramount.
Okay. Well, Madam Chairman, I would just end by saying, and this isn't direct to these folks, democracy is extremely messy. Command and control is very neat, but usually doesn't lead to good results. Thank you.
Representative Hooker.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your hard work. Some of my questions have already been answered, but one, the time to administer the test. I talked to a local charter school that has been doing a computer-based test, and their K-8 school and they really did a pilot on the Smarter Balance test. And he immediately said to me, don't let this happen. It took more than twice as long for us to do 2 grades, and the time away from the classroom, the time away from teaching was so significant that if you're talking about 1 time a year versus 2 or multiple times a year, he said this test takes a lot longer. So the time on task, the time away from learning is a concern that I have. And this is local. For me, it's local. And really, you know, some of the other things that have been mentioned earlier are also brought up by my locals.
In terms of the time aspect, yes, as you know, Joseph mentioned, and we talked about looking at assessing things with more constructed response and getting to that deeper student understanding requires different types of items that take longer to answer than just filling in multiple choice bubbles. That's part of it there. We are also looking at assessing writing in more than just 3 grades that we do now. If we look at the grades in 3 through 8 where we do assess writing, looking at Smarter Balance, we're looking at about 30 minutes longer to go through those assessments. It's a little bit more than that in high school in terms of the anticipated test length, and mainly the extra test length comes from these performance tasks that we're looking at, which have a classroom activity that students go through together and is part of the assessment experience, but it's also directly related to instruction.
And obviously, you have a teach to the test that has to happen, and especially if your pay is determined on that and your school rating is determined on that, we're talking a great deal of time could be taken away from actually learning.
Let me address that particular point. I think the issue is you want to test, if people are going to teach to the test, you want a test worth teaching to. And that's what we're going for, because that's, if you have something, almost all of the computer adaptive tests that are in schools now are 100% multiple choice. Doesn't drive high-level thinking in the classroom. What we're talking about is driving high-level thinking in the classroom, and we want a test. If it is going to be used for those kind of purposes, it needs to be something worth teaching to.
Thanks.
Thank you. Representative Price.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Probably a question that should have been asked a little bit earlier, but wondering, and this is a great test question, could you compare and contrast what the department did in its earlier recommendation, in formulating that recommendation about Smarter Balanced, versus this set of recommendations? So I'm just kind of saying, how did you arrive at that earlier conclusion versus what you've presented to us today? And I know some of that was organic in the earlier stages, but could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. With that earlier version of our recommendations, there really wasn't anything else out there. Since that earlier recommendation, there have been many more products that people have begun working on. This actually allowed us to compare and contrast the products that are out there. And what it really does look like, based on essentially what we've seen in the responses, is that there's only one that is really ready to go to do all that we need it to do. That doesn't mean that there won't be additional ones later on.
Thank you. Representative Lipton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a couple of questions. One is just is very simple. Dr. Martineau, did you occupy any role within, or do you currently occupy any role within the Smarter Balanced consortium? I'm sorry. Do you have a particular role currently or formerly in the Smarter Balanced consortium?
Yes, I am the co-chair of the executive committee.
Okay. And do you feel that
Representative, can you speak up a little? Thank you.
Sorry. Do you feel that position, do you feel that you were able to fairly analyze all of the information that came to you?
I actually did not participate in the analysis.
Okay. Wonderful, thank you. With respect to the report, there are a couple of data points that I just want to make sure that I understand. On page 23, one of the data points talks about clear evidence the state of Michigan retains sole and exclusive ownership of all student data. The student data that we're talking about, I assume, the information once the student has taken the test, or any data that is accompanying the student in preparation for taking the test?
It's both. So it's information that goes along with the student in terms of what school they attend and how old they are, what grade they're in, but also their responses to test questions.
The test questions. I'm just wondering, I'm just curious, because on the answer that you've compiled, you say that Smarter Balanced among 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there's 7 that meet that criteria. Appears to fully meet requirements based on responses provided. I'm assuming you didn't look at any other outside information. For example, the contract between the state of New York and their implementation of Smarter Balanced and In Bloom, which is a Rupert Murdoch, Bill Gates joint venture. That is, you're smiling, so I'm assuming that you know In Bloom, but, and I also noticed that Amplify Education is listed, which is, of course, the Rupert Murdoch company. But I'm just curious how you can reconcile that, because obviously there's now a class action lawsuit in the state of New York on behalf of all the parents of students that took that test that are now suing the state of New York and the Department of Education, along with their Commissioner of Education and along with their entire Board of Regents, over the transfer of that information from SBAC to In Bloom, and it's now sitting on their servers. So I'm wondering, can you please explain how you can reconcile that? What clear evidence that the state of Michigan has in hand? Because I've read the consortium contract as well as the MOU. I don't see it in there, but perhaps there's more documents that I could FOIA.
She likes to FOIA.
I do. It's that niggly trial attorney in me, darn it.
So, New York is a member of the PARC consortium, not of Smarter Balanced. So New York actually has no relationship with Smarter Balanced. And in fact, it wasn't the PARC assessment, it was their own assessment. And it was about a contract between In Bloom and the department, not between In Bloom and the contractor, and the testing contractor. So we are very careful in the contracts that we sign, indicating that we own the data. There also is...
But you understand that FERPA was amended in 2011 to allow for educational organizations to now be included as those that are entitled to that information. So again, I'm not trying to be clever. I want to know specifically what clear evidence that you relied upon that the state of Michigan retains sole and exclusive ownership. And if the answer is, I don't have it, that's fine. But I'd like to know. And when I say clear evidence, I generally am looking at something in writing.
Yeah, so what we have is the responses from the contractors that said that yes, you would retain clear sole and exclusive ownership. We also
They submitted that under penalty of perjury?
No.
Okay. So
we do, however, have particularly a data privacy, a data privacy and data use agreement that has been voted on by the consortium. And it is in the final stages, and essentially there's, at this point, it essentially says no individually identifiable student data will ever be shared between a state and the consortium unless the state asks the consortium to host it. We're not going to ask the consortium to host it.
So, sorry.
Asking today or in the future?
But I assume that there are no attendant requirements that there be parental notification or anything of that sort, that, for example, that Virginia is looking at.
That would not be pertinent because we're not sharing any of that information with the vendor.
Okay. So you're relying on you're relying on the consortium, some data privacy written statement within the consortium, which I assume that you'll be happy to share with everyone on the committee.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And we would be relying not only on the policy, but on a contract, whenever we have a contract or a binding MOU or whatever ultimately is the vehicle for setting the parameters of engagement.
Right. But of course, you know that federal law would trump any internal
Absolutely.
private contract, right? And FERPA, of course, would take authority over that, correct?
We actually have the right to be more strict than FERPA. We do not have to be less strict than FERPA. We have the right to write our contracts to be more strict than FERPA if we feel it is necessary.
Okay, and you believe that what you're going to show to all of us, presumably at some point in the not too distant future, would actually provide presumably the clear evidence that you relied upon here.
Yes.
Okay. And the last question is with respect to the costs that are listed, I believe, on page 17. I think that's, yeah, okay. And the, under the data point on page 16, that compares Smarter Balanced, a computer adaptive test, and paper and pencil. The 1562 that you list, I'm assuming that's in addition to the 2250?
No, that is a student either takes it paper and pencil or online.
Okay. Okay. But are you factoring in the fact that under the consortium contract that the state of Michigan signed on page 2 of that consortium agreement, it clearly states that the new assessments being planned by the Smarter Balanced Consortium are in English, language arts, and mathematics. And
this is just for English language arts and mathematics.
okay, so you did not include any costs for example, social studies, things that, for example, we know we're going to have to test in order to evaluate teachers.
Correct.
Okay.
This comparison chart was just English language arts and math.
Okay. And you weren't asked to do any additional costs. So we assume that there's probably going to be a lot more involved if you add in a social studies test and a science test or what have you, right?
Correct. There are additional costs.
Okay. And then finally, an organization, are you familiar with Education First? By chance? Yes?
Yes.
Nodding yes? Yes, okay. So they looked at some additional assessment costs, and they, by at least their research, which I'm just wondering what your thoughts are. The Smarter Balanced Consortium states, will assume more of the services not built into the consortium's decentralized structure. States will procure and pay other vendors for test delivery, scoring, and reporting. And they give some costs in terms of what that might involve. And so I wanted to just confirm that, of course, those additional costs don't show up in your analysis on page 16 and 17, correct?
No, they are included.
They are included.
They are based on actual bids we got and contracts that have been awarded.
But do they include, because it says here that the states will procure and pay other vendors for test delivery, scoring, and reporting. So did Smarter Balance provide those other vendors and some estimate of costs, or did you just build that in based on an estimate?
So what happens, again, this goes back to what Smarter Balanced is and what Smarter Balanced isn't. Smarter Balanced is a membership organization of states that bands together to achieve economies of scale on developing content.
Yes, right, I understand that, yeah.
We issued an RFP to administer our assessments in grades 3 through 8 and day 3 of the high school assessment, right, which is our Michigan developed portion. We received back bids from vendors to do that administration, scoring, reporting, printing, shipping, processing, scanning, all the stuff that we do. Those costs are built into what we have for the Smarter Balance.
Okay, excellent, thank you.
Thank you. Representative Potvin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question follows Representative Hooker. That is, how much classroom time do you plan to be dedicated to the preparation and the taking of this test?
Looking at the current time that we spend, so being the local control state, the amount of time that folks dedicate instructionally to prepare for the assessment or to this teaching to the test pieces, we don't have any data or evidence on that. What we do have are estimated times for students to navigate the actual test events. And so for that, we have recommended maximum time. For MEEP, for example, that's around between 8 and 9 hours, depending on which grade is being tested and if we're testing just reading and math or reading and math and writing. And we have comparable time estimates for the Smarter Balanced assessments. Through this spring with Smarter Balanced field testing tests across the 24 states that will be of comparable length to the operational tests. We'll get very refined information about exactly how long it takes students in different grades on math test or reading test to actually take the test. But we don't have information across the consortium or within the state about how much instructional time a local district or school would choose to allocate to that process.
When you get an idea what it's going to be exactly, it would be nice to know, because we've only got 180 days for these children to learn every school year, and if you're going to dedicate 3 or 4 weeks to this, you need to be rethinking again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Senator Young.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you so much for your testimony. This might be a dumb question, but I just have to ask this. Has this contract already been awarded, or are we still talking about this? Is this?
So the contract for administration, scoring, and reporting, the paper and pencil, the printing has been awarded and a contract signed. That was done quite some time ago.
Okay.
The contract for paper and pencil administration and all of the scoring, whether that's electronic scoring or paper and pencil scoring, has also been awarded and the contract signed. The online administration, so the online administration tool, the tool that students would actually use to go online and take the test, that has been awarded, but a contract not yet signed. It's very close.
Okay, so the decision has already been made. You just kind of hear coming back on report, telling us like what services you're going to offer, or I mean, you know, not that I don't like seeing you or anything like that. I just want to make sure I understand like why I'm here. I'm not here necessarily to influence or have discussion of who's going to get the contract. You're not getting input for that. You're just here to tell us we got the contract. This is what we gonna do. You know, we'll listen to your opinions, but we really don't have to because we got the contract already. Deal with it. I mean, is that basically what you're telling? I mean, that's just what I'm picking up. I just want to make sure I'm right about that. Or
so. The answer to that is we actually sent out the request for proposals early 2012. We received the bids in late 2012. We evaluated the bids in late 2012, and we awarded contracts in January of 2013 before any of this stuff came up.
Okay. Was that a competitive bid?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'm done. Thank you. Thank you. I'm done.
And you're here also because of the study. We wanted to have the legislative body receive a report on the study that was required because we, as a body, do fund the assessment. So, Representative Franz, Vice Chair Franz.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much. I'm back here.
Just a comment, if you would, and I'm sorry the superintendent had to leave because it was really directed at him. I appreciate him coming up and defending his employees in such a vocal manner. I used to defend my employees and when I had them because it's critically important for that kind of esprit de corps, if you would, and especially Ms. Larvik here, who I used to get emails from at midnight. I know how late she works. But I would like to point out to the superintendent that the questions raised by some of the members of the committee here were not, I don't think, to imply personal gain as he implied. It's more to put across the point to you folks that if you hadn't noticed, Common Core was a very contentious issue, and that we are still answering questions with constituents on that issue, and it seems exceedingly convenient that the standard assessment meets the Common Core in the manner that it does, and that you have a long history of supporting that. We're not saying, I'm not saying that you have anything personally to gain or that the superintendent does, but please pass along to the superintendent, we also have a responsibility too.
Thank you. Representative McMillan.
I had one last question, and it's really about the testing window. Because this is fascinating, because initially it was, I think, a 7-week testing window, and now I think they said after 80% of instruction, and it's going to be like a 12-week testing window. So how in the world, you know, those poor teachers that'll be evaluated in that first couple weeks, I mean, if I wanted to be evaluated, I'd want to make sure that it was, you know, I had as much instruction as possible. Plus, we're talking about a testing window. We've got some taking pencil and paper. I heard up until 17-18. It won't be, you know, it'll be optional up until the 17-18 school year. So that's a totally different test than the, you know, computer adaptive. So it seems like there's, and again, a 12-week, are we assuming that the paper and pencil, you know, no child will have a iPhone, you know, to take some pictures in the whole nation? We're talking about the state, but the nation. And I know you said we're going to have multiple paper and pencil tests for validity, but then you've got different tests, so you're not testing the same thing of students. So this whole, I mean, and I think it goes along with the whole central planning and thinking that you can do everything from Lansing or Washington or whatever. But I think this is one of the problems of many that come in, is that this, you know, logistics and everything's going to be fair when it's obviously not going to be fair. I mean, how do you have a fair, we have a one-day testing window. There's a reason for the MEEP. You know, and parents withholding their students like they are in New York. I mean, it just seems like there's a whole host of things that just keeping it internal might be the better angle. But it's very interesting, a 12-week testing window. I just can't even fathom what that looks like or how that's going to work. And again, it's paper and pencil versus, you know, it's all kinds of different things. So.
Yes, so I'm going to I'll take those one at a time, paper and pencil, and then window. Yes, the paper and pencil will be a bit of a different experience. If you look at the research literature on what's called equating, you can create a scale that is reasonably comparable with a computer adaptive test and a paper and pencil test. What you lose with the paper and pencil test is the level of precision that a computer adaptive test gets you. You can still have a reasonably comparable scale that you can put students on. So we don't want students to be having to take this versus using paper and pencil, but that's the reality in which we live. There will be schools that will need to be able to take it via paper and pencil, so we're providing that option. We can get to the place where we have reasonable comparability for the high-stakes decisions. The testing window, that is a significant one, and in fact is one of the things that is essentially holding up that last contract that I talked about we haven't quite yet been able to sign, is that we anticipate that because of the high-stakes use, schools and teachers are going to want to test as close to the end as possible. What that means is that there would be a major spike at the end of the testing window. Being able to handle that is critical for us. So being able to handle that is what is essentially the final points on negotiations to make sure that we're not going to have a Minnesota experience in which the testing system went down. We're not going to have a Wyoming experience in which the testing system went down. We are being extraordinarily careful to make sure that that doesn't happen in Michigan because, frankly, it can't.
Then the textual, I'd heard that they're going to try and do computer grading of textual answers. Is that true? And it obviously won't be computer adaptive questions, but non-computer, or maybe, I can't imagine they're going to test it on the fly, or grade it on the fly in order to get to the next question, but are they really going to try and have a computer grade what the child meant in the textual answers in Smarter Balance?
So, yes, there are portions there. We are clearly aware of the strengths and weaknesses of artificial intelligence scoring. One of the things that we have committed to is that we would not use artificial intelligence scoring where it has not been demonstrated to be equally reliable and valid to a human scorer. In addition to that, we don't think that's quite enough. We're talking about a significant read behind by human scorers, particularly on anything that the artificial intelligence says, well, I'm not quite sure on this one. So it is about making sure that we can, one, save costs where it does make sense, and in fact it does make sense. There are several scoring engines out there that are equally reliable and equally valid to human scoring, but you always want to do that read behind to make sure that there's not something going wrong with the algorithm, and if there is, then you rescore. But it also is, we're not going there where it's not going to work, where we haven't been able to demonstrate that it will work. And second, we will be following behind with validation to make sure that we're not doing something that would not be appropriate for any individual student.
Thank you. With no further questions, I want to thank you, all three of you, for coming and presenting the report and your findings of this study. I appreciate your time, and I'm sure there'll be many more questions as we go through the budget process as well. So thank you very much. As I did mention, there will be another hearing where we will gather more public testimony as well. So at this time, I do expect it to be... Oh, yes. Can we get an excused absence for Representative Stallworth on the Education Policy Committee? So moved by Vice Chair France. Thank you very much. We are adjourned.